For 5 long years, the halls of diplomacy had echoed with promises. In glittering chambers across distant star systems, Solaran envoys had bowed their heads, traded away resources, and spoken words they barely believed in, all to avoid the war everyone feared. But each promise was a hollow shell. The Zarith Dominion, masters of manipulation and power, accepted concessions only to break them in secret. Colonies were stripped of their resources, merchant fleets vanished into uncharted space, and prisoners of war were quietly erased from records, their fate sealed in forbidden laboratories. When Solara Prime's final message came, it was only 5 words: "Talks are over. We're done." Then, the homeworld went silent. Captain Kalen Vera stood alone on the observation deck of the Shadowlance, a sleek vessel built for stealth and precision. The ship floated on the edge of the Rhinoth Nebula, where clouds of ionized gas swirled like restless spirits. Violet and silver currents twisted in the dark void, glowing faintly as if whispering secrets no living mind could understand. Kalen had once been Solara's voice of hope, the envoy who had spent years negotiating with the Dominion. He had believed that even the most ruthless empire could be swayed by reason. Yet every compromise had only deepened Solara's chains. The Dominion thrived on deceit, smiling in public while drawing knives in the shadows. As Kalen stared at the nebula, his reflection glimmered faintly on the glass, a tired man with sharp eyes, worn by years of failure. He was not afraid. Fear had long since burned out of him, leaving only a cold certainty. Behind him, the crew of the Shadowlands moved in silence. They did not wait for orders. They understood. Each person aboard had endured the cost of the Dominion's treachery. Selric Thane, the navigator, had once been a starship officer whose wife vanished after a Dominion inspection. Raran Dask, Kalen's first officer, was a former Marine who had buried his entire squad after an unprovoked raid disguised as an accident. The rest of the crew, veterans, deserters, miners turned fighters, all bore scars both seen and unseen. They were not soldiers of fortune. They were witnesses to betrayal, bound together by loss and a shared truth. Peace had been nothing but a leash, and the leash had finally snapped. Kalen pressed his hand against the viewport. The cold glass vibrated faintly with the ship's heartbeat. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to that quiet hum. It was strange, he thought, how silence could feel heavier than any sound. It was not empty, it was full of meaning, of decisions made and paths chosen. "Captain." Selric's voice broke the stillness. He stood a few paces back, his expression grim. "It's begun." "Solara Command, they've gone dark. Every fleet, every outpost. No signals at all." Kalen turned slightly, his face unreadable. "Then we understand each other." Selric hesitated. "You think this is war?" Kalen looked back out at the nebula, its ghostly light painting his features in pale hues. "No," he said softly. "War is loud. This is something far worse." Far below the ship, lightning crackled inside the nebula clouds, illuminating fragments of forgotten wrecks, silent tombs of ships lost to battles long past. Kalen watched them drift aimlessly, hollow relics of conflicts no one remembered anymore. He thought of Ashvara, the colony where his son had lived. The Dominion had wiped it out in an unconfirmed incident, leaving behind no records, no survivors, not even bodies to bury. It was not grief that hollowed him, it was the absence of closure. The kind of absence that left a wound which never healed. Now, Solara Prime had chosen absence as its weapon. No more pleas. No more diplomacy. Only silence that the entire galaxy would learn to fear. In the mess hall, Rarandask stood with folded arms, staring at the crew as they prepared weapons and systems. No orders yet, he asked. A junior officer shook her head. Nothing. But, we know what's coming. Raran gave a faint nod. There was no need for speeches. They all understood. Hours later, Shadowlands began to move. Engines hummed at barely audible levels, their stealth drives consuming space around them like shadows swallowing light. The first target was already chosen, a Zarith supply relay on the edge of neutral territory. It was a quiet, unarmed station, meant for trade convoys and fleet refueling. The crew did not celebrate. They did not cheer for vengeance. Each of them carried the same grim understanding: this was not about victory. It was about making sure the Dominion finally understood the price of betrayal. Kalen stood at the command console, his gaze fixed on the star map. "Selric," he said calmly. "Coordinates locked," the navigator replied. Kalen nodded. "Then let the galaxy hear nothing." Shadowland slipped into the void, vanishing from sight. And so, in that moment, the era of silence began, not as surrender, but as judgment. Because sometimes, the loudest answer is no answer at all. The corridors of Shadowlands were dimly lit, their walls humming with restrained power. Every step echoed faintly, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. There were no banners of war, no rousing speeches, no sounds of pride. Only purpose, quiet, heavy, unshakable. Captain Kalen Vero walked slowly through the vessel, his boots tapping against the steel floor. Each familiar bulkhead reminded him of years wasted in chambers of diplomacy. He remembered the Zarith delegates with their practiced smiles, their hollow assurances, and the way they had feigned offense whenever Solara dared to demand justice. Kalen had once believed that reason could tame empires. He had believed in laws, treaties, and the fragile web of galactic unity. Now, as he passed his crew in silence, that belief felt like a distant dream. A faint chime pulsed through the ship. Selric Thane, the navigator, appeared beside him holding a data pad. "Captain," he said, voice low. "We've received a black level code from Solara Command." Kalen stopped, eyes narrowing. Selric swallowed. "Autonomous engagement. No confirmation required." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Black-level codes were never spoken aloud in public records. They meant one thing: every ship would now act alone. There would be no fleet admirals, no central orders. Solara had severed its own chain of command. In the armory, Rarandask oversaw a team of soldiers checking their weapons. Their faces were carved from stone, men and women who had already lost too much to care about medals or victories. Raran turned to Kalen as he entered. "Orders." Kalen met his gaze, steady and cold. "You already know them." There was no hesitation. Raran simply nodded and returned to his task. Kalen continued to the war room, a circular chamber where the walls displayed faint holographic projections of nearby star systems. The faces of the crew, illuminated by the pale glow, looked more like ghosts than living people, haunted, hardened, resolute. For a moment, Kalen thought of the early days, when young diplomats would speak of unity and compromise as if history had not been written in blood. He remembered believing that humanity could rise above its past, that they could be better than the empires before them. But history had been cruel. Solara's kindness had been seen as weakness, and the Dominion had exploited it without remorse. Selric's voice broke his thoughts. "This isn't just war anymore, Captain," he said quietly, almost afraid of his own words. "This feels different." Kalen turned, his expression unreadable. "It is different. War is loud, full of speeches and banners and justification. But this," he looked out at the star map, where countless systems awaited judgment. "This is what comes after the begging stops." The crew exchanged glances but said nothing. They didn't need to. Every soul aboard the Shadowlands understood that the silence they carried was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of a decision made too late to be undone. Far beyond the ship's hull, the stars shimmered like cold witnesses. The galaxy had always underestimated humanity because humanity had been willing to talk. Now, that willingness was gone. And in its absence, something far more dangerous had taken its place. The Shadowlands drifted through space like a phantom. Its dark hull drank in the starlight until it became a shadow among shadows. Inside, the crew moved with silent discipline, each one knowing that what was about to happen would change more than just the balance of power. It would mark the point where words were no longer trusted, where action became the only language left. For months, they had trained and prepared, but the first strike was different. It carried weight. Every person aboard understood that once they crossed this threshold, there would be no return to treaties, no illusions of peace. Ahead of them floated the Zareth supply relay, its great wheel-shaped structure turning slowly in the dark. Long docking arms stretched outward like skeletal fingers reaching for passing ships. Cargo drones hovered lazily around it, unaware that their final minutes were already counting down. Kalen Vera stood at the command console, his eyes locked on the holographic projection of the station. His expression was calm, but behind his stillness was a storm of memory, years of negotiations that had led nowhere, years in which the Dominion had smiled while tightening its grip on every Solaran colony it could exploit. Beside him, Selric Thane's voice was soft, almost reverent. "Coordinates locked, Captain." His hands moved across the controls with steady precision. Kalen gave a single nod. "Engage stealth drift. 1/4 burn. No transmissions." The Shadowlands obeyed, gliding closer like a predator unseen. The ship made no sound. It left no trace. Raran Dask stepped into the command chamber, his rifle resting against his shoulder, even though no boarding would be required tonight. He had fought too many battles to abandon old habits. His eyes met Kalen's, and in that brief exchange was an unspoken question. "First blood," Raran murmured. "You ready for that, Captain?" Kalen did not look away from the projection. "We passed the point of readiness a long time ago." Inside the relay station, Zareth workers performed their duties without urgency. Automated signals chimed softly as crates were catalogued, as cargo moved along tracks, as drones flitted from port to port. The station felt safe, shielded by false promises written on broken treaties. But history had always favored the comfortable right before their fall. "Rail systems charged," Selric said. The words were simple, yet they pressed down on everyone in the room like a heavy weight. Kalen's hand hovered over the console. He allowed himself one brief moment to reflect not on revenge, but on the futility of diplomacy that had led them here. How many chances had been given? How many times had humanity chosen restraint while others chose cruelty? Then he pressed the command. Fire. 3 railgun rounds slipped into the void without sound. They traveled faster than light could betray them. The first tore through the station's life support core, snuffing out air and heat in a single heartbeat. The second severed the main power conduit, plunging the entire facility into darkness. The third shattered the communications array, cutting off any chance for a distress signal. In just 14 seconds, the station was dead. No alarms. No warnings. No survivors. The holographic projection flickered as the station's systems failed, its glow dimming until only fragments remained on the display. Selric's voice broke the silence, faintly trembling. Target neutralized. No transmissions detected. Kalen didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the fading projection, his face as still as carved stone. After a long moment, he whispered, barely audible, one silence added to the rest. No one aboard celebrated. There were no cheers, no triumphant exclamations. The crew simply returned to their stations, faces set in grim focus. Because this was not victory. Victory is loud, full of pride, of declarations, of banners raised high. This was something colder, sharper, more enduring. It was justice delivered in silence, with no need for words, and no desire for glory. And deep within that silence was a lesson older than any treaty, that mercy, when exploited, will one day be replaced by reckoning. The shadow lance drifted through the dark void like a ghost. It moved with purpose, each crew member knowing that this mission would mark the moment when Solaris stopped pleading for peace and started delivering judgment. The first strike was quick, silent, and merciless. A Dominion supply relay, unguarded and unprepared, was erased in just 14 seconds. No alarms. No survivors. Kalen whispered as the projection of the destroyed station faded, one silence added to the rest. But this was only the beginning. What came next would shake the Dominion to its core. Far across the stars, in the heart of Zareth Command, panic began to spread like fire through dry fields. The first reports arrived as fragments, signals that stopped mid-transmission, trade convoys that never reached their destinations, outposts that had gone completely silent. At first, the High Council dismissed them as technical errors or isolated pirate attacks. But as the hours passed, the pattern became undeniable. Entire sectors were vanishing from the Dominion's maps without a single distress call, without a trace of resistance. In the Grand War Chamber, light from the holographic star map painted the faces of Zareth generals in pale blue. Their voices clashed like blades as they shouted over one another. They must be using new weapons, one general hissed. Find them, hunt them down, and burn their colonies to ash. No, another countered, her tone shaking. We cannot fight what we cannot see. We must reach out to the Solaran Council and dash. Council, a third scoffed. They've been silent for weeks. Diplomacy is dead. They're already at war with us, whether we admit it or not. The chamber filled with rage, fear, and confusion. They were Empire's worst emotions, signs of power crumbling from within. High Regent Azhir sat at the center of the chaos, his ancient face pale, his tendrils drooping like withered vines. He had ruled the Dominion for decades, always believing the humans to be malleable, naive, easily cowed by reminders of their violent past. But now, they had vanished into silence, and that silence was louder than any threat he had ever heard. One of Azhir's aides approached with trembling hands, holding a report. "Regent, we've lost another relay. No alarms, no signals, nothing." Azhir took the report slowly. He read every line twice, though each word only confirmed what he already knew. The Solaran fleets had stopped speaking. And when a species built on survival and fire chose not to speak, it could only mean one thing: they no longer sought permission, only results. The council chamber fell into uneasy quiet as Azhir finally rose from his seat. "You still do not understand," he said softly, his voice cutting through the room more sharply than any shout. "They are not playing our game anymore. We gave them treaties, then broke them. We taught them that mercy is weakness, that trust is foolish. And now," he glanced at the star map, where more and more systems flickered out like dying lights. "Now they are teaching us what silence means." No one argued with him. No one had the courage to. The realization settled over the chamber like a suffocating fog: the humans were not declaring war. They were delivering judgment quietly, deliberately, and without mercy. And for the first time in centuries, the Dominion understood fear not as a weapon used against others, but as something finally turned back on them. Far away, in the halls of Zareth Command, panic spread as more systems went dark without warning. Leaders argued, generals shouted, but none of them had an answer. High Regent Azhir understood the truth: humanity was no longer seeking peace or power. They were carrying out something far colder: judgment without words. And while fear consumed the Dominion, the Shadowlands prepared for its next mission, one that would reveal the full depth of the enemy's cruelty. The Shadowlands moved through the void like a blade drawn in silence. Its next target was not a supply hub or a military station. Intelligence reports had revealed something far darker: a secret biological facility hidden in the shadow of a barren moon. This was no ordinary research post. It was a place where the Dominion's cruelty had shed all pretenses of civility. Here, Solaran prisoners, civilians, soldiers, even children were subjects of experiments, their lives twisted in the name of progress. Raran Dask stood with his squad in the ship's armory, adjusting his combat gear. The room was quiet, but not from fear. Each soldier's silence came from knowing what they might see once they breached the facility. Kalen entered, his gaze steady but heavy. "We're not here to capture. We're here to confirm and then erase everything." Raran nodded grimly. "Understood, Captain." The Shadowlands dropped from stealth above the moon. Its landing thrusters released only a faint hum as the boarding pods detached, streaking silently toward the surface. The facility appeared small from the outside, its structures low and unassuming. But beneath the surface, the Dominion had built a labyrinth of laboratories and holding cells. When Raran's team breached the first chamber, the smell hit them, a sterile chemical stench mixed with something far worse, the unmistakable scent of suffering. Rows of containment pods lined the walls. Inside were Solaran children, pale and weak, eyes half-lidded as tubes ran into their frail bodies. Some were barely breathing. A soldier whispered, voice shaking, "Gods, what have they done?" Raran's face hardened, but his hands trembled slightly as he checked the readings on one of the pods. Neural activity spikes forced brain linking. Farther in, they found soldiers strapped to tables, their skulls opened, their brains wired into alien machines. Others had been fused with synthetic organs, their bodies twitching involuntarily as if begging for release. In one corner, a woman still breathed, though her spine had been replaced with a living, chitinous construct that pulsed unnaturally. Her eyes darted toward Raran as he approached, silently pleading. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and gave her the only mercy left. By the time they reached the main control room, no one spoke. Rage simmered in their eyes, not in shouts or curses, but in the unshakable knowledge of what had been done here. Raran opened a channel. "Captain," he said, his voice hoarse, "everything in the reports was true, and worse." There was a pause on the other end. Then Kalen's voice came, cold and absolute. "Erase it all." Explosives were planted along every critical point: life support, data cores, power conduits. The team moved with mechanical precision, their silence no longer discipline but grief made solid. As they boarded the Shadow Lance once more, the facility erupted in a controlled implosion. No alarms rang out. No last transmissions escaped. Back on the ship, no one celebrated. There was no joy, no pride. Only a grim acknowledgement that they had done what needed to be done. Kalen remained in the command chamber, staring at the fading fire on the moon's surface. "We warned them," he murmured to himself. "We begged for peace. And they answered with this." In that moment, everyone aboard understood, this was no longer about politics or strategy. The silence they carried was not just a weapon. It was judgment, shaped by every innocent life the Dominion had stolen. The Shadow Lance discovered a secret biological facility hidden beneath a barren moon. Inside, Raran Dask and his squad found horrors beyond imagination: children used as experiments, soldiers wired into alien machines, prisoners stripped of their humanity. When they returned to the ship, no one spoke. Kalen's voice was quiet, cold. "Erase it all." The facility was destroyed in silence. But the images of what they had seen haunted every member of the crew, leading to a decision that would change the nature of the war itself. The Shadow Lance returned to deep space, its engines humming softly as it slipped once more into the void. No one on board spoke of what they had seen in the Dominion's laboratory. Words felt useless now, too fragile to describe what had been done to the prisoners of Solara. Kalen sat alone in the command chamber, his eyes fixed on the dark expanse of stars. The memory of the facility clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. For years, he had argued that humanity's strength lay not in its weapons but in its principles, that restraint was the higher path. But principles meant nothing to those who mocked them. A notification flashed on the console. Selric approached cautiously, handing Kalen a secure data tablet. "Captain," he said quietly, "this just came through. Black level encryption. It's from what's left of Solara Command." Kalen opened the file. Inside was a long list of targets: Dominion shipyards, cultural archives, command hubs, memory vaults. At the top of the file, a single phrase was written in stark lettering: "Erasure Protocol, Phase 1. Selric looked at the list, his expression uneasy. "This isn't just war anymore," he said, voice heavy. "It's history deletion." Kalen stared at the names of the targets. These were not only military installations, they were the foundations of Zarith culture, the places that held their art, their history, their memory of who they were. Raran entered, his face still cold from what they had seen at the laboratory. He glanced at the file and clenched his fists. "They chose this when they butchered our colonies. They taught us that mercy is weakness." Kalen's eyes lingered on one name in particular, a Dominion archive on Vithra Prime, a planet known not for war, but for being the cradle of Zarith knowledge. For centuries, the Dominion had prided itself on preserving history, yet they had erased Solara's without hesitation. He thought of his son, lost on Ashvara. There had been no body to bury, no name etched on a memorial. The Dominion had stolen even the dignity of remembrance. And now, humanity was preparing to return that lesson. But Kalen hesitated. Was this truly justice, or was it something else entirely? Raran broke the silence. "Captain, we have our orders. We carry them out. End of discussion." Kalen closed the file. His voice was calm, but the storm inside him raged. "We will carry out the protocol," he said finally. "But understand this: every target we erase makes us more like them." The room fell silent. No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew he was right. A new file arrived from Solara Command, the Erasure Protocol. It was not just a list of military targets. It was a blueprint for erasing an entire civilization, its history, its culture, its memory. Raran said nothing, but his eyes burned with fury. Kalen, however, hesitated. "Every target we erase makes us more like them." That doubt, once small, began to grow. And soon, it would no longer be possible to ignore. The Shadowlands floated in the quiet between stars, its crew moving like ghosts through dimly lit corridors. Each person went about their duties without speaking, their faces cold, their thoughts heavy. The success of every mission brought them closer to victory, yet farther from the people they once were. In the war room, Kalen stood alone, gazing at the star map that shimmered with countless Dominion worlds. Each glowing point of light seemed like a heartbeat, fragile and fleeting. Raran entered quietly, his boots echoing softly against the steel floor. He stopped a few steps away from Kalen. "You're hesitating," Raran said, his voice steady but edged with concern. Kalen didn't turn. "I'm thinking." "About what?" Kalen exhaled slowly. "How many more names we're about to erase. How many more children won't grow up knowing their own history because of us? Raran's jaw tightened. Captain, we've seen what they did at the facility. We've seen the colonies they burned, the families they stole. They didn't give our children a chance to grow up with their history. They didn't even let them live. Kalen finally turned to face him. I know. But that's what frightens me, Raran. Every step we take makes us more like them. Every time we silence another world, I wonder if we're erasing more than just the Dominion. Maybe we're erasing ourselves. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Kalen moved to the viewport. Beyond it stretched the infinite dark, pierced by distant starlight. He thought of Ashvara, of his son's laughter, how it had once filled his home. That laughter had been silenced forever, leaving only absence. They took my son, Kalen said quietly, his voice almost breaking. They left me nothing to bury, no body, no name, just a blank in the records. Do you know what that feels like? Raran's hardened expression softened. I do. Kalen's hands curled into fists at his sides. So now we give them the same absence. Because that is worse than death. Raran stepped closer, his voice low but firm. This isn't about justice anymore. It's about vengeance. And vengeance never ends where you think it will. Kalen looked at him, his eyes sharp but filled with doubt. I know, Kalen admitted. But after what they've done, I don't know if there's another path left. Outside the ship, the stars remained silent. Inside, the unspoken truth settled over them like a weight. Victory was no longer the goal. The war had become something darker, a reckoning that might consume not only the Dominion, but humanity itself. The crew carried out mission after mission. More worlds vanished. More history was erased. But the silence inside the Shadowlands was changing. Raran confronted Kalen. This isn't justice anymore. It's vengeance. And vengeance doesn't end where you think it will. Kalen looked out at the stars, haunted. Maybe you're right. But after what they've done, is there another path left? It was then that an unexpected voice from the past would force them to confront the truth they had been avoiding. The Shadowlands moved like a silent predator through the emptiness of space. Starlight slid across its black hull, as if the ship itself had become part of the void. Inside, the crew worked with the same precision they had shown since the first strike. Every movement was deliberate, quiet, and efficient. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had begun to change. The missions no longer felt like victories. Every erased world left behind a silence that grew heavier than the last. Each time a Dominion system vanished from the star maps, the crew felt the weight of what they had done settle deeper into their chests. What had started as righteous judgment was slowly becoming something darker, something none of them had words for. In the command chamber, Captain Kalen Veras sat in front of the star map. The glowing projection illuminated his face with cold light. Systems blinked softly in blue, but many were marked in red, dead, erased, gone. Kalen's eyes followed the red points, each one a world whose history no longer existed. Libraries turned to ash. Songs that would never be sung again. Names of children, lovers, and families now lost forever. He thought of how much time humanity had spent fighting to escape its violent past, believing it had finally grown beyond conquest and destruction. Yet here he was, presiding over a war that left no room for surrender or forgiveness. A sudden chime broke the silence. Selric Thane, ever watchful, stepped closer to the console. "Captain," he said cautiously, "we're receiving an encrypted signal. Origin unknown. It's old Solaran code." Kalen's brow furrowed. "Put it through." The crew turned as a message appeared on the main display. The sender was identified as the Starhaven Echo, a ship long believed destroyed in the early days of the war. The message was short. "No threats. No accusations. You've gone too far. This isn't justice anymore." The room was silent. For a long moment, no one breathed. Selric's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Sir, they're saying what some of us have been thinking." Kalen's hands tightened on the edge of the console. He said nothing, but his eyes hardened. Raran entered the chamber, glancing at the display. His face was unreadable. So someone finally said it out loud. Kalen turned slowly. "What would you have me do? Stop? Pretend that everything we've done can be undone?" Raran met his gaze with quiet resolve. "No. But maybe we should start asking if every name on that list deserves to vanish." Kalen looked back at the star map. The red marks spread across it like fire devouring dry grass. For the first time since Solara Prime went silent, doubt flickered in his eyes. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about what humanity would become when the erasures were complete. If history was destroyed, if an entire culture was wiped from memory, what would be left of their own morality? Could a people who erased others still claim to be better than those they condemned? Later, Kalen sat alone in his quarters. The lights were dim, the hum of the ship barely audible. He played the message again and again. "You've gone too far. This isn't justice anymore." Each time he heard the words, they felt heavier. They were not an accusation shouted in anger, they were a quiet truth, undeniable and raw. For the first time, Kalen wondered if they had already crossed the line that separated justice from vengeance. Because vengeance always feels righteous, until you realize it has no end. And deep down, he knew the voice on that message was right. A signal arrived from the long-lost Starhaven Echo, "You've gone too far. This isn't justice anymore." Kalen replayed the message again and again in his quarters. The words felt heavier each time. For the first time since Solara Prime went silent, he truly wondered if they had already become the very monsters they once despised. But before Kalen could decide what path to take, a new voice broke through the void, a voice that would remind them of what they were meant to protect. The Shadow Land sailed through a sector of deep, empty space, where the stars were thin and far apart. The crew moved in silence, as they always had, but the atmosphere had shifted. The doubt that Kalen felt after the message from Starhaven Echo seemed to hang over everyone, unspoken yet heavy. Kalen sat in the command chamber, staring at the star map. More systems had turned red, erased. The pattern looked less like a war map and more like a spreading wound. He could no longer look at it without wondering how much of humanity's soul was burning away with every erased world. A sudden alert broke the quiet. Selric checked the console. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "Captain, we're receiving another transmission. It's weak, old Solaran frequency. Not Dominion." Kalen straightened. "Put it through." The screen flickered with static before a voice emerged, young, shaking, but alive. "If anyone still remembers who we are, please, help." The voice repeated, words breaking with desperation. The crew froze. For the first time in weeks, they weren't hearing a plea for surrender or negotiation. It wasn't an enemy begging for mercy. It was someone calling for help. Selric turned to Kalen. "It's coming from the edge of unclaimed space. Signal's old. Whoever it is, they've been calling for a long time." Kalen stared at the static-filled display. The voice belonged to Daxon Vale, a teenage boy from the forgotten colony of Haven Reach. His family had been slaughtered by raiders during the chaos that followed Solara's silence. His ship had been left adrift, surviving on failing rations, sending out calls into the void, calls that no one had answered. The boy's words were not filled with anger. There was no blame, no hatred. Only hope that someone might still care enough to listen. For the first time in many weeks, Kalen felt something shift inside him. It was not guilt, not fear, but the sharp sting of realization this was what they had been fighting for. Not power. Not revenge. But for voices like this one to still exist. Raran stepped closer, his face unreadable. "Captain, what do we do?" Kalen didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the screen, as if looking past the static, past the darkness, to the lonely boy who had refused to give up hope. Finally, Kalen whispered, "Set a course. We're going to find him." The crew exchanged glances, but this time, something different flickered in their eyes, something that had been gone for too long. It was not vengeance. It was purpose. Because even in the darkest silence, a single voice asking for help could remind them all why they had once chosen to fight. It was not a Dominion leader begging for mercy. It was a boy, Daxon Vale, a teenage survivor from the forgotten colony of Haven Reach. His voice was weak but unwavering. "If anyone still remembers who we are, please, help." Kalen listened in silence. For the first time in months, a mission was not about revenge, but about saving someone who still believed humanity could be better. And so, for the first time in a long time, the Shadowlands set a course not to destroy, but to rescue. 4 days later, the Shadowlands emerged from subspace near a forgotten trade route. Wreckage of old freighters floated silently, their hulls scarred by pirate raids. Amid the debris drifted a small, battered civilian vessel. Its engines were dead, its lights flickering weakly like a dying ember in the void. Inside, a boy sat alone in the dark. Daxon Vale 17, malnourished, but alive, curled against the cold wall of the ship's cabin. His voice had grown hoarse from calling out over dead channels. Yet even after so many unanswered pleas, he kept sending his message, as if refusing to believe the galaxy had abandoned him. The Shadowlands latched onto the vessel with a quiet docking clamp. Kalen entered the freighter himself. The boy looked up, his eyes sunken but still bright with the stubborn light of hope. "You're Solaran," Daxon whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly would break the moment. Kalen nodded. "We heard you." For a second, the boy didn't move. Then his shoulders trembled, not with fear but with a quiet relief so powerful it hurt to see. Back on the Shadowlands, Daxon was given food and water. The crew people who had long since forgotten how to smile watched him eat as though witnessing something sacred. No one said it aloud, but all of them felt it. The boy was proof that they hadn't lost everything. That there was still something worth saving. Kalen returned to the command chamber. He looked down at the console, at the long list of targets waiting to be erased. His hand hovered over the controls. Then, for the first time in 70 days, he opened a channel. The transmission was simple. 2 words, sent out into the stars. "We hear." The silence cracked. Not with the roar of weapons, but with something far more dangerous: hope. As the message traveled across the Solaran fleets, crew members on countless ships stopped what they were doing. For weeks they had been executioners in the dark, obeying the unspoken command of vengeance. Now, for the first time, they were reminded of why they had taken up arms in the first place. It was never about annihilation. It was about ensuring that voices like Daxon's could still exist. In the quiet mess hall, Rarandask sat beside Kalen. He didn't smile, but his voice was softer than it had been in months. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Kalen nodded slowly. "This is what victory was supposed to mean." Raran leaned back, his eyes distant. "Maybe it's not too late to remember who we are." The Shadowlands sailed through the stars once more, not as a ghost of vengeance, but as a reminder that even in the darkest silence, humanity could choose to listen again. And sometimes, the most powerful answer was not a shout, not a weapon, not even a demand. It was a whisper, sent to someone who had almost given up. "We hear." It was not a Dominion leader begging for mercy. It was a boy, Daxon Vale, a teenage survivor from the forgotten colony of Haven Reach. His voice was weak but unwavering. "If anyone still remembers who we are, please, help." Kalen listened in silence. For the first time in months, a mission was not about revenge, but about saving someone who still believed humanity could be better. And so, for the first time in a long time, the Shadowlands set a course not to destroy, but to rescue.